Hello, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining myself and a couple of fabulous gents from our payroll practice today for the latest HR on the Offensive Live. Really screwed up that intro, and that's one of the downsides of when you do live streaming. You don't get to hit, I'll do that one again. But we are live. I am talking to Simon Puryer and Chris Kirby from our practice team. How you guys doing? You all right?
Good, thanks, Chris. How are you?
Yes, really good. Really good. Now, gents, I wanted to grab you just for 5, 10, 15 minutes so that we can have a little bit of a chat about an upcoming webinar that we've got. Now, the webinar is all around payroll as a magic button, or maybe there is no magic button. So what we wanted to do today is just have a chat about some of the bits that we're going to talk about in that particular webinar. We're only going to sort of touch on a few bits, but we thought it might be interesting just to leave some of our watchers of these live stream videos just a bit of a heads up. So I'm going to kick off with the first sort of question around, I guess, what it's about, Simon, and that's where I'd like you to just give our viewers a little bit of an overview. What are we talking about when we talk about payroll and this idea of a magic button?
Magic button, yeah. Well, I think it's a bit of a sort of dark art, the whole payroll thing. You know, a lot of people don't really understand what's involved in running payroll. I'm guilty of, when I first worked on a payroll project many years ago, I had no understanding of the complexity. And therefore, you know, when we talk to people within the payroll function, there is this kind of standing joke that people go, well, all you need to do is just press that magic button and that's it. You know, people just think instantly payroll's calculated, job done, no real work involved. And I think that is, as I say, because people just see it as something that sort of trundles along in the background. And of course, when it's working fine, no one's really worried about it. And they just assume that all people need to do is press a magic button.
Yeah, indeed. And Chris,
no, so much more than that.
Yeah, and Chris, from your perspective, you've obviously worked much like Simon. You've worked in-house. Have you had to explain to some of your colleagues in the past there is no magic button?
Absolutely, yeah. And particularly when it comes to change, I think you know, the concept of this magic button leads to payroll being at the end of the chain, and you know, quite large foundational transformational projects are, you know, launched or moving, and it's seen that payroll, they can just change how they push the button. You know, this stuff doesn't really matter. So constantly fighting that battle, both through my operational career and now in my consulting career.
Yes, indeed. So what I want to do is just go through a few of the sort of topics that we were going to discuss, or we will be discussing in a few weeks' time. Chris, I want to kick off with you, because one of the things that you and I did a few weeks ago is we actually talked about the payroll operating model. For those of you guys who are perhaps checking out some of our content for the first time, we've had a campaign that's been running for about a month and a half now. And we've produced a whole variety of different blogs and podcasts, and it's all around demystifying HR's operating model. But you and I went into a little bit of a deep dive into the payroll sort of questions that are asked. So can you just give our viewers of this just a little bit of an overview as to the sort of things that we might touch on in the webinar and what we're talking about when we're talking about payroll's operating model?
Yeah, of course. I think the word operating model, sorry, as a phrase, is quite vast and quite generic, right? And I think it's easy when you think about a payroll operating model just to hone in and focus on, you know, are you in-house? Are you a managed service? You know, is it fully outsourced? And those are very valid things, right? That underpins how the payroll function will be operating. But I think there's also the side you mentioned around HR operating models there, and a lot of that is around business alignment. So from a payroll perspective, one of the big challenges always is the way that you're operating payroll aligned with how the business operates. So if you've got a vast HR, global HR function, and they're aligned by business unit, but your payroll is centralized, that can create problems in itself in the sense of trying to manage an unmanageable volume of work and requests and transactional activity that maybe serve better if the way that the function was structured was a bit different. But then it also comes down to, fundamentally, there's a bunch of things that payroll and payroll teams have to do, right? So between the legislative side, change management is a big one that's often overlooked as a fundamental part of, a payroll operating model. How do you manage that? Where's the resource to manage that? How do you make sure that payroll are represented on all those changes? Obviously the BAU, the day-to-day activities. So within that, you've got the transactional side of things. You've also got the reporting and the strategic analytics side of things. And also, especially in global operating models, there's potentially the requirement for on-the-ground support. So, just because in the UK we don't necessarily have to have people walking into tax offices, doesn't necessarily mean that's the case everywhere in the world. So, some parts of mainland Europe, you might need on-the-ground support, whatever your operating model is. So it covers a vast array of stuff. And on the webinar that we've got coming up, we'll dive into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, we certainly will. And Simon, I don't want to cut you out of that particular bit as well. So from your side, some of the clients that you've spoken to over the years, how often are they thinking about their operating model, or do they think about it so holistically like that? Or is that one of the big challenges?
Yeah, and I think that is, as Chris said, it's that thing of people perhaps label operating model when perhaps they don't really understand, what's involved. They think they need to change their operating model when maybe they mean they need to change their system, or vice versa. And I think what we're always encouraging people to consider is, and it goes back to this magic button piece, really, that it's so much more than just a system. There's everything that kind of surrounds it. When you think of the people, the process, the data, all of that sits around it, technology is only just part of it. And actually, when you're making any kind of change, no matter how big or small, you need to consider the overall impact on that operating model and how potentially you can do things smarter, differently, more effectively. So again, as Chris said, it's something that we'll be very much touching on in the webinar in the next few weeks.
Yeah, we certainly will. And I just wanted to, so Chris, you mentioned it when you were talking about the operating model, but Simon, I'll stick with you because we talked about this just before we went live, the impact of managing change in payroll. So can I just get just a minute or so on your thoughts around what are some of the challenges that clients come across when they're thinking about, not just clients actually, just payroll teams, what are they coming across when they're thinking about, or how do we manage the change and the transition that we have within our business?
Yeah, and I think again, it's a hard one to sort of position in the sense that it depends on what you're actually changing as to how big or small the change is or how big or small the impact is. I think the underlying point with all of this, though, is that payroll impacts every person within every organisation, and actually, what often gets overlooked is that by implementing a change, let's say someone is implementing a new system, that's going to impact every employee, because the likelihood is every pay slip is potentially going to look slightly different. And people think of it as very much just the impact almost on the payroll team, but actually it's so much broader than that. So you need to think about it in the context of, from an employee experience perspective, what's the impact going to be on all of your colleagues, but also from a sort of function perspective, if you're changing something in payroll, does that make a change upstream as to how some of that data is going to be coming into payroll? Does it change some of it downstream as to the output that's perhaps going to go through to finance, for example? So again, it's just thinking about it kind of more holistically, more significantly from an overall change perspective.
Yeah, Chris, anything to sort of build on that? Because obviously you mentioned a couple of times about the impact of change. It feels like it might be quite a significant talking point in the webinar, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, back to the whole magic button concept, I think change in payroll and indeed in HR is very similar to payroll itself, in the sense that if it just works and it's successful, people just assume it happens and it's the magic button being pushed and everything's fine. And I think you need to look at change through the same thing. And ironically, you actually want to reach that goal. So you want people to not even really know that there's been a change, other than that maybe their payslip might look slightly different. Actually, there wasn't a material impact to them. And to achieve that, as Simon touched on, it really needs that holistic view. You can't achieve that if you're not focused on things like the employee experience and the changes upstream to the people that might need to do something differently because of what you're changing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got one more topic. I just want to get you guys to have a a quick comment on before we wrap up for today. Just as an aside, some of you who are watching this video may be seeing the ticker across the bottom of the screen. That's actually the website URL link that you can actually access if you want to register for the webinar. So it's the 15th of May, Wednesday 15th of May. We're doing it at 1 p.m. lunchtime. So have a check out of it, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of these topics that we've talked about: the operating model, the managing change in payroll. But what we'll also be touching on, again, I'll start with you, Chris, and then Simon, if you can just build on it as well, is raising the role of the payroll function. And this is an interesting one, I think, because we've run a number of face-to-face events, networking events, and quite often there is a lot of talk around how can we manage the kind of the perception of payroll. So Chris, just some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think the simplest answer is to shout about it. I think, it's very easy for payroll to slip into, a back-end transactional function that kind of achieves, people being paid accurately and on time every month, which ultimately will always be the goal, right? We're always going to have to achieve that. But there's far more that goes into it, and actually shouting about it, playing back to the business what, payroll have been able to support them with, and also shouting about what they could be supporting, what payroll could be supporting the business with. So there's an incredible amount of data, of information and knowledge that payroll and payroll teams have in every organization that can be used to inform all sorts, from strategic business decision making to strategic HR decision making. And I think it's just important for payroll and payroll leaders to make sure that the business are aware of that, because simply it's the unknown unless you do.
Yeah, Simon?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to build on that, I think, again, it goes back to this kind of thing of people not really understanding what goes on within the payroll function. So as Chris said, you've got to kind of do everything to raise the profile around that. I mean, interestingly, we find, we work a lot with clients to undertake what we call a kind of payroll health check, which is to kind of get a holistic view of the payroll operation. And I think the power of something like that is it starts to help kind of communicate to the wider audience as to just what's involved from a complexity level of managing that payroll operation. The number of times we'll kind of get a high level view of kind of left to right of what actual activities have to take place to manage that payroll day to day. And when you position that with the wider sort of senior stakeholders within the organization, they're suddenly surprised at just how much work's involved. So I think, unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, it is about just trying to kind of shout about all of the activities that take place. And at the end of the day, ultimately people don't work for fun, they work for money. And actually, if that function isn't operating, then you're going to have an unhappy workforce. So you can't have a business without a payroll function, ultimately.
Well, exactly, as you said, people don't work for free. Well, some do, but certainly the vast majority of us don't. I've just popped up, just as we're finishing up today, the link, just in slightly larger font, if those people want to quickly access it. It's lacepartners.co.uk/payroll 2024. And as I said, we'll be running that webinar. It'll be an on-demand one as well, but we'll be running that on Wednesday, the 15th of May. No, not yet, May. That's it. Where am I? Wednesday, the 15th of May at 1 p.m. Chris, just before we wrap up today, any kind of final thoughts or anything that you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Maybe just to reiterate my aging statement around making sure you're focusing on the causes of some of the challenges and not the symptoms. I think a lot of what we've spoken about today, maybe sits in the symptom bucket, but there's often an underlying cause that needs to be resolved, and maybe focus on that.
Yes, certainly. Well, on behalf of myself, Chris and Simon, thank you very much for watching this very, very short video, and hopefully we'll see you at our webinar in a couple of weeks' time. But from me and the team, thank you very much, and thanks for listening to the latest Lace HR on the Offensive live stream. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.